I wanted to say just a quick note about why I'm talking about this, because I feel it's slightly out of my wheelhouse. But I'm interested in, recently I've been interested in Descartes' ethics. And I wanted to see how these ethics play out in, some of his early followers. One of the things I was particularly interested in, or I wanted to become interested in, was how sort of Descartes' ethics, how his physics and how his physiology has a role in arguments about equality of the sexes, or maybe even the races, and how it might even work into a politics. So as I dove into this, it seems like, at least at first gloss, the Cartesians have almost an extreme equality where they think everyone is essentially the same. And so you can see early on in the discourse on method, Descartes starts with, what's a joke? He says, "Good sense is the best distributed thing in the world, for everyone thinks himself so well endowed with it that they do not usually desire more of it than they possess." I mean, which is, a great joke to start a serious treatise off with. But it's not really a joke. He goes on later in the discourse to say, reason exists whole and complete in each of us. So in a sense, we're all endowed with the same reasoning abilities. We have essentially all the same type of soul. And that made me wonder how Descartes can explain difference. And what I'm looking for is what I just loosely call a principle of difference. And that is whatever physical, mental, or other properties sufficiently explain variation in mental capacities between people. So, a slightly silly way to put this question would be, if Descartes is so smart, why am I so stupid if we all have essentially the same capabilities, if we're all given the same tools? And it seems like at first gloss, you can't explain that difference by any appeal to the mind. And I was wondering if this was sort of the common reception, and if there was any way to sort of finesse this problem out of his early followers. And it seems like his early followers take this in a number of different ways. Some of the followers put the differences clearly in the body. Others take this radical equality in a different way. And I wanted to present really quickly two different examples. So the first one is from Malebranche, who you'll see has just this wildly sexist view. And I'll just read it to you. "The delicacy of the brain fibers is one of the principal causes impeding our efforts to apply ourselves to discovering truths that are slightly hidden. The delicacy of the brain fibers is usually found in women. Normally, they are incapable of penetrating to truths that are slightly difficult to discover." So we see, sort of abhorrently, this principle of difference between mental capabilities being located in the brain structure itself. Later on, we can see a different philosopher, François Poulain de la Barre, who takes it a completely different direction, where he says, "It is easy to see that sexual differences apply only to the body, since, strictly speaking, the body alone is involved in the reproduction of human beings and the mind merely gives its assent, and does so in the same manner in everyone. It follows that the mind has no sex." So the brain composition, at least for Poulain, doesn't seem to really matter. But again, it's really funny when you're reading this, he'll say something like that, and then, shortly after, he'll go back to the physical aspects of the brain. And so I included another quote: "Women have a high, noble, and broad forehead, which is normally a sign of imagination and intelligence. That means that their brain is so disposed that it receives impressions from objects easily, including the weakest and lightest impressions that escape those with alternative dispositions." Which, us poor men with our Neanderthal foreheads just aren't well disposed to discover things. So I wanted to ask like why these Cartesians are so interested in putting differences in the body and not in the mind. And looking at Descartes, there at least seems to be some type of arguments. And essentially, Descartes argues that the soul has a type of simplicity. So you can't load it up with these different parts, and you can't put too much, epistemological justification into the mind itself. So there are a number of arguments he gives. The first one in Meditation 6, he says, as for the faculties of willing, understanding, of sense perception, and so on, these cannot be called parts of the mind, since it is one and the same mind that wills and understands and has sensory perceptions. So here he's talking about the mind almost as like a vessel. You can put different fluids in it, but it's always the same vessel. Or you can think of it as the faculties sort of cycling through the mind, but only containing one at a time. So you have this unity. He gives further arguments later on where he seems to be using something like separability as a criterion of what's included in the mind and what's not, or how to define the soul's simplicity. So, I mean, essentially he's saying nothing in the mind can be separated from anything else in the mind, thus it has that type of simplicity. This is contrasted with non-essential or bodily faculties that might have a mental correlate. So I highlighted one more passage. I find within myself certain special faculties for thinking, namely the faculties of imagination and sense perception, without which I can clearly and distinctly perceive myself as a whole, but not them without me, that is, without an intelligent substance to inhere in. So essentially what he's arguing is if you have a faculty that can in some way be separated, well, then it's not truly part of the mind. And Descartes, as I think a lot of us know, ends up imparting a variety of different mental faculties actually into the physical brain. So the imagination goes to the brain, memory goes to the brain. You know, the majority of our sensory abilities go to the brain or the nervous system, etc. So what does all this have to do with Descartes' medicine? Well, as I dug into this topic more deeply, I realized that this argument for simplicity, which seems to be sort of this abstract metaphysical argument, actually ends up having implications for how he interprets the body and how some of his followers interpret the body. So I wanted to trace that out as well. And this comes most obviously in Descartes' theory of the pineal gland. And so I wanted to talk, although this might be familiar to the majority of people here, I wanted to talk really briefly about some of the arguments that Descartes held for the pineal gland. Because a lot of these arguments correspond really neatly with his metaphysical requirements for the soul. So we saw just now that the soul is simple. Because it has no parts, it can't possibly be divided, and obviously it's non-extended. When Descartes looks for a seat of the soul or a physical organ for the soul to interact with, he's looking for essentially the same thing. I mean, which still to me makes no sense, but I'll just repeat it anyways. He wants it to be simple, undivided. Obviously, it can't be non-extended, so that's the main difference is it has extension. So the simplicity and undividedness of it strikes me as really weird. I think what he's thinking of is he just wants some like homogeneous whole made out of some, just one chunk of stuff. It can't be made up of bone and fleshy stuff and blood and whatnot. It just needs to be one, I don't know, goopy bit. And it can't have any obvious divisions or any I think really what he's looking for is like seams. Like it has any seams, or if you can compartmentalize it in terms of function, like if you had like a bladder in it and then some tubes or something, you could, you know, divide it up by function. And so he looks at the pineal gland and, you know, famously he's wrong, but like he's like, yep, that's perfect. We have this simple thing all made out of the same stuff. It doesn't have any obvious seams or divisions. So we have a good perspective seat for the soul. But there are also practical considerations that go along with this. The soul, according to Descartes, because it's simple, can only be united to one organ. That organ needs to be able to move freely so it can effectively translate the volitions of the will into bodily movement. And it also needs, obviously, to be appropriately connected to the nervous system, etc. Again, so it can appropriately communicate those volitions. So that's, you know, sort of Descartes' side of things. And it's a really weird argument, I think, just flat out. And also later on in Descartes' career, he seems to be running up with problems in this, where it seems like he has something like an intellectual memory and, you know, maybe even an intellectual imagination that's independent of the body. It gets really confusing, and I'm not sure what to think about it. And so I wanted to look at some of the early Cartesians, how they're adopting this theory and how they're adapting the theory, to see if that could help clarify anything. And what I ran into was this really fascinating case in Régis. So this is Pierre-Sylvain Régis, who was quite a notable Cartesian. As far as minor figure goes, he was pretty major. So he was around from 1632 to 1707. You can see his most major work here, which is the Cours entier de philosophie, or the système général selon les principes de Descartes. What's interesting about this text, well, there's a number of things. One, it came out of a lot of work that Régis had been doing, holding conferences and trying to spread Cartesianism. The other thing that makes it really interesting is that it comes quite late. It was published in 1690 for a number of, I think, political reasons, really, or quasi-religious reasons. But by this time, in 1690, the Cartesian pineal gland theory was sufficiently exploded. It would have been wildly irresponsible for any Cartesian, I think, is in 1690 to defend anything similar to the pineal gland theory. So they had to change, and they had to adapt, and this is what Régis does. So instead of locating the seat of the soul in the pineal gland, he locates it in what he calls the Centrum, which I think in English is the Centrum Semiovale, and that in this diagram is area AA. And so this is where he thinks the majority of the interaction between the soul and the body happens. But this has some notable implications for simplicity in general. Specifically, when we're looking at, you know, Descartes' requirements that the physical organ be simple, undivided, and extended, we're going to have to initially lose simplicity. As for Régis, he thinks the Centrum Semiovale is composed of parts. Not only is it composed of parts, but it has little tubes, it has large flows of animal spirits or subtle matter, and they're constantly moving through these different sections of the centrum. So it can't be simple, it also can't be divided. Now, because of this, it's also going to have different requirements for the practical location of the physical organ. Because it has parts, it's continuous with a bunch of different tubes and other parts of the brain, it doesn't follow anymore that the soul can't be united to more than one organ. For Régis, I think we can say it actually is. Excuse my animation. The free movement of the organ also changes. For Régis, it's not important that the centrum moves, but that things move inside the organ. However, the last requirement does still need to hold, that it's appropriately connected with the rest of the body, which Régis thinks it is. So can we say that the Centrum Semiovale is just pineal gland 2.0? Well, I think given everything that I've just argued, I think that there's no plausible way to say it. And I wanted to highlight some more differences between Régis and Descartes on this, and then I want to tease out the implications of how they have metaphysical implications and implications for his, well, we'll see, ethics and physiology in general. As we've seen, like, all the metaphysical arguments drop out. But more than that, for Régis, the centrum is properly considered the seat of the imagination. And I know Descartes describes the pineal gland as the seat of imagination, but I think they mean it in completely different ways. For Descartes, the pineal gland receives impressions from the imagination, but for Régis, the centrum is actually holding those impressions from the imagination. So they're actually happening in the centrum. Not only that, those impressions that the centrum receives can actually be imprinted on the organ itself, and it actually changes over time. So you can develop, sounds weird, but you can develop your centrum semiovale, and an old person's centrum semiovale is going to be different than a young person's centrum semiovale, which itself is a dramatic change from Descartes. But beyond that, because the Semiovale has more parts, it has to do more explanatory work. And Régis actually ends up imparting more mental faculties to the organ itself. So he gives physical correlates to reason and physical correlates to judgment happening in the organ itself. Which again is a very dramatic difference from Descartes. So I guess, why do we care about all this? Well, I'll tell you. So one thing I just think is interesting is, at this point, we can say that the pineal gland theory is really dead. They weren't trying to save the reasonings, at least Régis was not, but I think I can speak more broadly. There was no adapting the reasonings. It was just rejected wholesale, metaphysically and physically. Paradoxically, because the physical seat of the soul needed to be more complex, for Régis, you can't have these extra bits of stuff doing nothing, or just bonus bits of your brain. They need to be doing something. The soul actually needed to be simplified. So more of the soul needed to be outsourced to the physical organ in the brain. And here's where I think it gets really interesting. I think because of this, because you have reason, judgment, etc., being outsourced to the brain, you have the soul taking on this ever-shrinking responsibility, to at the point where I think for Régis, the soul does essentially nothing except it is the reason why you can perceive things. So when we need to explain error, or we need to explain what I call the principle of difference between people, you have no recourse at all to the actual soul, which again is a major departure from Descartes, but sort of the natural progression given the physiological discoveries of the day. This in turn helps us understand just how far-reaching Régis' empiricism was. Régis adopts the sort of basic empiricist credo that there's nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. And I think he takes this very seriously because the description of the brain and how it works and the seat of the soul won't allow for anything else. But finally, returning to the first thing I started with, this understanding has sort of wide-ranging implications for how we interpret Régis' principle of difference and his ethics more broadly, because he can't have it where there can be this broad equality between the sexes. Unfortunately, he has to relate things to physical differences, which, you know, is an interesting tension with standard Cartesian dualism, I think. But lastly, and I think this is the point that's been emphasized over and over in this conference, is we have this oddly symbiotic relationship between physiology and metaphysics. And also, I mean, but the relationship goes both ways, where Régis' metaphysics influences how he's interpreting, you know, structures in the brain, and how he's interpreting structures in brain also influence how he's thinking about the soul, which I think, well, I think it's fun, but I'll end on that. So thank you for bearing with me.